truths of the faith over and over again. And there's no shame. In fact, there's great strength in having your personal Christian devotional life often just coming back to these same truths over and over again. I think it was Richard Baxter, I may be misremembering this, but I think it was Richard Baxter who said, really, all I want to do is I want to preach to my people the Ten Commandments and remind them of the gospel. In other words, these are the sort of simple, basic building blocks, and yet these are the things we come back to again and again. The Psalms were like that for Luther, and that shaped his life. It's interesting, even today, to fast forward into our own time, in most churches, many churches, the Psalms are not prominent, they don't play a prominent role in worship. There are some, of course, denominations that still sing psalms on a regular basis, and some which only sing psalms, so it's a smaller percentage. But our lives aren't shaped by the psalms in the way that Luther and the other reformers wanted our lives to be shaped by the psalms. And there's something lost in our day because of that, I think. I mean, I'm always struck by the fact when I go through the Psalms with students that if you divide the Psalms up into different genres, different types of Psalms, what you find is the biggest genre, the biggest type, if you categorize it all out and sort of file them in different places, the biggest one is lament. And that's very much, that's not part of our spiritual vocabulary. We don't feel like we have words or the right emotions when things are going badly, but the Psalms do give us those. So Luther has a personal devotional life shaped by the Word, and if I were to get more specific, I would say he has a personal devotional life that's shaped by the Psalms, just as a child might do, he says. Third area in which his life and his thinking was shaped by the Word is Luther's understanding of the role of government, or the role of, he would say, the civil magistrate. In 1523, Luther writes a very important work that lays things out this way. He says that Christians belong to, or that human beings, rather, belong to two kingdoms. Christians, I think you would say, belong to two kingdoms at the same time. They kind of have a foot in two worlds. On the one hand, they have they're in the church as Christians, and on the other hand, they're in the world. And Luther would say that these two kingdoms, these two spheres of influence, are governed in different ways. The church has as its way of governing the Word and the sacraments. And the world has the sword as its way of governing. And the important thing to realize here is Luther is not trying to say that these are that you should try not to be a part of the world and try just to be a part of the church. He's saying that in a sense both of these things are necessary for the functioning of society. This is part of the way it's supposed to be. After the fall, this is kind of how things work. So what Luther's doing is something different from what the church in the Middle Ages did. In the church in the Middle Ages, you had a very clear division. You had sort of spiritual work over here that takes place in the church, and then you had all this sort of tainted, worldly stuff that happens over here. And Luther says, no, our view of the civil magistrate should be different from that. We should recognize that it rightly has the sword as its means of enforcing what it does. In fact, this actually comes to a sharp, pardon the pun, I guess, a sharp edge, because Luther gets a question from a soldier who has begun to understand some of the things that Luther says. And the soldier writes in this letter and basically said, he understands Luther's teaching on work and on the civil magistrate, but he says, but I'm a soldier. I'm basically employed in a job that requires violence. So that's what it's all about, to be a soldier. And Luther, and is that okay? And how should I think about that? You know, as a Christian, am I just lost forever? Is there no hope for me? And Luther writes this beautiful response called, Can Soldiers Too Be Saved? And what he says in it is very clear, which is no. This is fine. If what you're doing is you're doing this for the building up of society and it's under proper authority, then this is something that you can do to the glory of God. So now this is going to raise a question, and it raises a question with a lot of people who interpret Luther, particularly after the events of Nazi Germany, because Luther, as a corollary to this idea, basically does say, listen, it is the responsibility of Christians to obey the government and to serve the civil magistrate as appropriate. The civil magistrate is not the same as the church, but nonetheless the civil magistrate has a sphere of influence that is legitimate, that is, in a sense, backed up by violence. Luther would go to Romans 13 to talk about this, and we ought to obey it. So some people have asked the question, Luther makes some very strong statements about obedience to the state. And some people, post-Nazi Germany ask the question, well, did this set the stage for people who would have called themselves Christians basically just acquiescing and saying, this is the government and we have to do whatever they say? It's maybe not a fair question to ask because it's sort of an anachronism to ask Luther a question about something that would happen 400 years after. But I just say that to not to try to untangle it, but just to say he is very strong on the notion that you need to obey the civil magistrate, and that the civil magistrate has a legitimate claim to your attention. Excuse me. Fourth area in which his life was shaped by the Word of God. And this is really related, I think, to the civil magistrate one. And that has to do with the notion of work. Employment, and by this I mean work outside of the church. I mentioned this already, but in the church in Luther's day, there was this understanding that there was spiritual stuff that people do. If you're a monk or a bishop or the pope, that's spiritual. And then there's all this other worldly stuff. And this wasn't exactly like what Luther says about these two spheres of authority. This was something different. This was a real kind of class system. That spiritual work, that's really going to set you on the path to salvation. That's really something God honors. And all this other stuff you have to do over here, making money and buying and selling and serving in the army and all that, well, of course people need to do that, but it's not particularly good for you spiritually and not particularly valuable. And Luther, in his appeal to the Christian nobility, writes this, takes this head on. It is a pure invention that pope, bishop, priests, and monks are called to a spiritual estate, while princes, lords, artisans, and farmers are called to a temporal estate. This is indeed a piece of deceit and hypocrisy. All Christians, Luther says, are truly of the spiritual estate. And there's no difference among them, except that of office. That's a profound statement. And it does really, as people begin to take it in and imbibe that, it does begin to change their attitude towards work. Because what Luther's saying is, you might be making shoes to make a living, but that's not less spiritual than what someone else might be doing serving in the church. All Christians are of the spiritual estate. There may be differences in office. If you're in the church, you have this word and sacrament oriented office and that kind of authority. But nonetheless, they're both spiritual activities. They're both good spiritual activities. I want to talk in a minute about the family, but this has implications for people who are serving in the family as well, who are at home, taking care of children, that kind of thing. Luther would say, this is a spiritual estate that you're engaged in. And I gave this example already about temporal authority, but even when the soldier writes him, Luther says, no, even that is included. As a Christian, that is a spiritual estate that you're in, even when you're out there doing your military stuff. This is all important and all spiritual in God's sight. I think it's really hard for us to even grasp how significant that was for people. Even Luther himself probably knew something about this, because it's hard to piece together everything that led Luther to the monastery. You know, he talks about the lightning storm, and we know he had some conflict with his father and things like that. But it's hard to know all the motivating factors and to piece that together. But one of the things that many people who did join monasteries thought, and Luther probably had this as at least part of his reasoning, was monasticism was called the surest path to God. And that's significant. If you really believe in God, if you really believe in eternal heaven, then you have to look at yourself and say, what do I have to do to make sure I'm on that path? And for a lot of people, the answer was, I need to get as close to the church as I can. And what's Luther saying here? Luther's saying, all are in a spiritual estate if they're Christians. Everyone's in a spiritual estate, although they may have different offices. Probably means he's also going to treat people differently in his church. He's not going to act as if his estate is spiritual and theirs is merely sort of worldly and unspiritual. He's going to value their work. They're going to value their work even more, because if it's done to the glory of God and for the good of society, it's a spiritual activity. Luther writes, further, everyone must benefit and serve every other by means of his own work or office, so that in this way many kinds of work may be done for the bodily and spiritual welfare of the community, just as all the members of the body serve one another. It's interesting in that quote because Luther uses language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians to talk about the church. We're one body with many members and different things that we're gifted in, different ways of serving the body. It's all for the building up of the body. Remember, Paul says, if everyone were an eye, where would the sense of smell be? But what Luther does is he uses that imagery of the body not to talk just about the church and all of us bringing our gifts into the church in service of one another, but he talks about it in terms of society as a whole. And all of us are kind of like a body in society. And as long as what you're doing isn't sinful inherently, as long as what you're doing is done for the building up of others and of the society, in other words, you're performing a useful service for society, and you're not doing it out of just greed or just to promote yourself, then it is a good work. It's a spiritual work. And it benefits everyone else. It's hard to draw a straight line between writings like that and the changes that take place in the 16th century in Europe in terms of the growth of the middle class and changes that take place in cities that grab a hold of the Reformation. It's always hard to draw a straight line between these things. And there are other factors at work that we could look to. But I think you at least have to factor in the notion that Luther and all the reformers took this essential attitude toward work, and it was a different attitude than that which was taken by the medieval Roman Catholic Church. It may be an attitude toward work that you take for granted, that you've always heard in churches, I don't know. But they had not. And that was not how they looked at their lives. And there was a sense in which many people in Luther's day, if they took God seriously, were almost apologetic about the fact that, yes, I take God very seriously, I really am serious about my Christian faith, but unfortunately I'm just a cobbler making shoes, and so therefore probably have very little hope of ever finding spiritual peace and rest or hope. So this is freeing. It's, in a sense, empowering for people, and it's transformational. Work shaped by the Word. Fifth, Luther's vision of the family is shaped by the Word. The most obvious way in which this works itself out is in Luther's embrace of marriage. Not first and foremost his own marriage, although he does get married, but actually his preaching that marriage is a good thing and should be embraced by all, even those who are preaching and teaching the church. As you know, the Roman Catholic Church of Luther's day required celibacy for priests. It wasn't always practiced. There are all kinds of accounts of sort of, secret wives that priests had, and sometimes not so secret wives that priests had, and these kinds of things. And even popes, and there are popes who have many children in the Middle Ages and things like that. But nonetheless, at least on paper, that was the idea. And there was a kind of denigration of marriage and even of sexual intimacy within marriage. That this was something that was a little bit dangerous, perhaps a kind of necessary evil, one might say. But Luther really changes all that. In 1519, this is even before he's, again, officially kind of for the last time kicked out of the church, he writes on the estate of marriage. And what he says there is that marriage is given by God for the purpose of loving friendship and of children. In other words, marriage is a good thing and it serves a good purpose. It's not a kind of plan B. It's not something that is just allowed for but not encouraged. It's not something that puts you in an unspiritual position. But in fact, it's embraced as a gift of God.